interesting, influential, knowledgeable, political people. And so it's a compliment to you and what you've done. That's, I mean, I can use the numbers that you caused to get access to these people. But then they also give up their time to do things like be in front of you. So I wanted to just pull up the panel and maybe give, actually, you know what? Maybe the easiest thing to do is I'll introduce you, Jen, and then you can do whatever you're going to do. So basically, we ran across Jennifer Ditchburn just as observers. There was this really sad time in my children's life when they were little babies, and Lindsay, I would come home and there would always be Power and Politics on from 5 to 7, and I was really worried about like their mental health. They were just kids. It's not a very friendly thing, so I would come home and I would put on classical music and then to try to change their thing. But so we would see Jennifer, and then we would see her work through the Canadian Press, I believe, that's who you were with at different points. And she just is super smart and knows her stuff. And so she left behind journalism to do like a bigger picture thing, where now she runs the policy options at the IRPP, which is one of Canada's very big and very well-respected think tanks. So it's an incredible catch for Graham and the IRPP that they got her, and it's a catch for us that that's our host for this panel. So Jennifer, thank you so much for doing this, and please bring up your really interesting and equally esteemed colleagues, and we'll have a really cool conversation this afternoon.
Not sure what this thing is for. All right, well, thank you. I think what I'll do first is I'll be a bit lazy and I'll ask each of you to introduce yourselves very briefly, and then we'll get into our conversation. And we're not going to talk the whole time, so there'll be a portion for questions, so make sure you get out all your best questions for this panel. So, Sean, I'll start with you.
Hello, my name is Sean Speer. I'm presently a faculty member at the University of Toronto School of Public Policy and Governance and a senior fellow at an Ottawa-based think tank called the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. I previously worked for the Right Honourable Stephen Harper as a policy advisor and a senior advisor over the course of about 6 or 7 years. And it was in that role that I got to know Taylor and the team at CIVIX and became a major supporter of the work that they're doing. And so when given the opportunity to join you today, I jumped at the chance, and I'm glad to be here.
Kathleen.
Hi, my name is Kathleen, and my background started in media at CTV News. As a scrappy morning television producer who used to fight with Scott, actually, in other movies. And then I went on to work, I'm still, after working in Toronto, Ottawa, and Washington, I jumped into politics in 2006 and worked for Jack Layton as his director of communication. And so my line there is always, no one can accuse me of being craven for power, because, you know, when I moved over to Jack, we had only a handful of MPs. And following my experience with Jack, and I launched a think tank called the Broadbent Institute and was the catalyst behind that. And now I'm currently working as a principal at Earnscliffe Strategy Group. And in my passions, I work with a lot of teacher activists, from EFTO to OECTA to OSSTF. So as a daughter of teachers, it's always amazing to be in a room full of teachers. So grateful to be here.
My name is Scott Reid. Made of metal, sorry about that. And my background also in politics, like these folks, a little bit like Kathleen, a little bit of a mix of politics and some media stuff. I currently work with a business partner named Scott Feschuk. If you guys like Maclean's magazine, if you like humor, you may recognize his byline. He writes a humor column every week for Maclean's, or every month now. I don't know. Maclean's is kind of online and monthly now, and it's so depressing to talk about news media in any way, shape, or form. And before all that, I worked for a number of years on the Hill in Ottawa, working for Paul Martin both when he was finance minister and prime minister as communications director, and helped run national election campaigns from the 90s through to the mid-2000s, and then been parking here in Toronto ever since. I don't have any awesome teacher credentials other than the fact that I went to school, and I've had the chance to do a number of these boot camps and work with Taylor and the crew, and it's been great fun, so always look forward to it. Thanks.
Thank you. And thank you, Taylor, for inviting me here. It's exciting to have my first civics event. So we're going to get into more specific issues around the Ontario and upcoming federal election. But I thought first we might talk about a concept that some of you might have heard of before, which is the idea of a permanent campaign. And it's something that political scientists like to talk about a lot. And that's the idea that people don't campaign anymore just in campaign periods. They're campaigning all the time when they're in government. Basically, it's like the election has never stopped. So I thought maybe we could have a quick go around about how does that permanent campaign manifest itself in terms of how we as the voters see what the government's doing, whether it's advertising, media relations, and so on. Sean, maybe I'll start with you.
Sure. We've really, this concept of a permanent campaign has really become part of our political lexicon in the past 15 years or so. I think in large part because of the series of minority governments that we had at the federal level beginning in 2004 until 2011. And the consequence of that, of course, is that governments were focused on their agenda, but they also needed to keep one eye on the prospect of a campaign emerging sometimes unexpectedly. It seems to me it's a consequence in large part of that experience that we had during what was a unique period in our politics. It's also a consequence, I think, of the role of political parties. Of course, a party's principal function is to win elections and form governments. And so there can be a tension between a government focusing on its agenda and on the interests of citizens, and the folks in the back whose function isn't about governing. It's about keeping an eye on the political party's principal function of winning elections. And so it's ultimately up to leaders, I think, to be able to have the discipline to try to wear both of these hats at the same time and resist the temptation to make every governing decision through the lens of the permanent campaign.
Kathleen, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd add, as someone who likely worked at the same time on the Hill as Sean, as someone who survived those minority governments and constantly lurching from crisis to crisis and a threat of the government falling, Jack himself tried to take down the government famously with a coalition attempt at the end of 2008 into 2009 that ultimately wasn't successful. But it does put political parties and the parliamentary side of political parties kind of almost always in a role where they're fighting fires. There is a political top note to all of the policy decisions that are being made. And what I mean by that in terms of my current role in terms of government relations or public affairs, consulting and strategy is that when you're looking at legislation that's coming down, you're constantly looking both at the ramifications of the legislation, the legal, the implications for stakeholders, but you're also asking what this means for the political party in power or conversely, their political opposition. So it's really the other factual point I will add that has contributed to, I think, all that Sean has said in terms of the growth of the permanent campaign, which is really a concept, if you need to trace it back for your political science class, I think really emanated out of the UK, out of London in terms of Alistair Campbell and the Blair government, and some of the work that they were doing as keen examples. But to back up to the relevancy for here, when Chrétien changed the funding mechanism and took away a large part of the large corporate and union money that was going, there was a need for political parties of every stripe to constantly campaign in between elections because of the need to fill those coffers. So I would say that's a real critical point that changed things. And I can tell you the digital fundraising that goes on, many of you who may get those kind of emails in your inbox know that it's ongoing and forever. The last thing I'll add before I turn over to Scott is I just want to say, though, I don't think that the permanent campaign is happening, but the problem is that citizens aren't necessarily permanently engaged, right? And I think that's where it really falls to the educators to have that critical thinking lens and to make sure that our students, not only our students, but our citizens of all ages are actually asking the right questions and thinking through what our governments are doing and why they are doing it.
So I think there's a couple of contradictions in the discussion around permanent campaign. One of them that I think is interesting is that we inherently assume it's a negative. Right? We immediately think, well, these things, that permanent campaign must be in conflict with good government. I don't know that that's necessarily so. A lot of what we think of as permanent campaigning, and I would say the intensity of what the so-called permanent campaign is, has maybe ebbed a little bit in Canada in the last handful of years, partly because we're no longer in a minority situation. There are other things happen too, but that affected the personalities of the leaders, the character of individual governments. All sorts of things have impacts on it. A huge driver is the desire to fundraise, the need to fundraise, and the constant level of communication. But the idea that you brand your leader, you brand your party, you're trying to constantly reinforce a positive image, that's not, that's not terribly new. And, I see a lot of parallels in that respect between Stephen Harper and Trudeau, actually. I think that both of those leaders are people who really understand who they are and who they are in connection with the citizens, right, with citizens. So you saw Harper constantly reinforcing a persistent thematic of, you may not like me, but I'm stable, I'm safe hands, I'm strong, I'm going to make solid choices, I'm not going to be unpredictable and erratic. Trudeau's brand is, I'm accessible, you are going to like me. God damn it, I'm going to make you like me constantly, right? Like, I'm all over you. I'm coming for dinner. But they both understand who they are, and they reinforce that image. I think where it gets really interesting with the permanent campaign, and this is just a narrow dimension of it, is when it extends into what we think of as more sort of negative campaigning. So when you see political parties, particularly those in government, because that's when we go, wow, they're diverting resources to obviously partisan purposes, when they're really trying to reinforce a negative characterization of others. And the most effective version, I'm actually part of a government, I think, that was guilty of being the first to do it. I think before the 2004 election campaign, we ran negative ads on Stephen Harper as he was becoming pre-writ, and nobody had ever seen it happen before. In fact, when we went to our political party, we have a sort of a comptroller and a group that allows expenditures and budgetary expenditures of the Liberal Party of Canada. When we went to that group and said we're going to do pre-writ advertising, they thought we were lunatics. They thought it was a poor expenditure of funds, that it would waste money in advance of the campaign, that wouldn't pay off during a campaign. They thought that it was ghastly and awful and a terrible precedent to set. And then, we had some effect with it. Certainly, I think we had a lot of effect. It had a lot of impact on the 2004 campaign. And then, of course, when we saw the Conservatives do it to Michael Ignatieff and just beat the living hell out of him, really, really, really well defined it before he defined himself, and combined, of course, with his own errors, really, I think, undermined his leadership. I think that's what people get their back up against when they think of the permanent campaign. They think of the permanent negative aspects of it, and then we start to relate it to American politics and say, well, there's constant two-year congressional races. Everyone's always crapping on one another, and that is the kind of race to the bottom thing. I'm not sure there's as much evidence of that happening right now in this particular cycle. There's not a need to. You got a majority government. You don't need to define the other guys right now. We'll see what happens if Kevin O'Leary becomes the leader of the Conservative parties, and if the Liberals, Conservative Party, and if the Liberals rush out and say, let's take full advantage to tell people who we think this guy is and who we think they should think this guy is. But right now, there's not a lot of evidence of that negative permanent campaign.
Sean?
Yeah, I just want to add to that. I agree with much of what's been said, but I do think one of the negative consequences is a tendency in our politics to inflate our differences artificially and to minimize our commonalities. One of the strengths of the Canadian political system, frankly, is that we have a broad-based consensus on so many issues, ranging from, generally speaking, from taxation to public spending to public health care to a role for public financing of infrastructure, so on and so forth. But because we're galvanizing our accessible voters, because we're trying to galvanize our supporters for the purposes of fundraising, we have this tendency to blow things up. Just to give you an example, the child care benefit that the Trudeau government has established, which they've had a tendency to describe as revolutionary, actually rests on a foundation that Mr. Martin started and Mr. Harper built upon. It's not to say it's not laudable policy, it is. But to describe it revolutionary and in some way a major differentiation from previous governments is incorrect. And frankly, I suspect they know that, but it's a consequence of this tendency to differentiate. And so I do regret sometimes, and let me be clear, the Harper government was as guilty of this as anyone. In fact, we perfected it. But I do think it's regrettable, and I hope that as we think about our democracy in the aftermath of the Trump election, our political parties resist this temptation because I think it's unhealthy and it obscures how much we actually agree upon.
So I'm just going to inject a bit of the journalist perspective. This might not be apparent to your students or to you, but within the government, there's a line that people know about, which is that you can't cross. If you work for the government as a public servant, you cannot do anything that's partisan. And I think one thing that the permanent campaign has brought to bear is a lot of pressure on bureaucrats to do things that seem kind of partisan. For example, and this happened during your government, branding every news release as the Harper government. So the Harper government announces X instead of the government of Canada is announcing X. And there was a lot of debate over whether that was partisan or not, or making every website blue or red or orange. There's all of that sort of weird blurring of the lines that happens when the political parties are always campaigning. So that's sort of another thing to keep in mind when you're watching Justin Trudeau at his the 100th event this month, and the copious numbers of videos that are posted to the Canada website. That's all taxpayers' money that's paying for that. And who's it for? Is it for the government, or is it for the leader and their political prospects later? So I just thought I'd throw that in there. The Ontario election is a year away. I'm sure you all know about that. So I'm wondering, from the three of you, maybe you can talk about what do you think the Premier, Kathleen Wynne, and her team is doing a year out to prepare? Kathleen, you seem to want to...
I'll take that. I think that Kathleen Wynne is trying to figure out how to get from 7% to 47% really quickly. I share with Scott some very good friends who lead and design and strategize about the campaign for Kathleen Wynne, and I'm not telling tales out of school when I say sometimes they think it's a bit of a suicide mission. That said, they are kamikaze and amazing strategists, so I expect them to fight to the end, and I would put money on Wynne staying in, not leaving, so that's my first point. I think she's tenacious. I think there's lots going to hook on the June by-elections that are happening. I know at least one is happening in Sault Ste. Marie. I believe there are others throughout the province. I'm not sure, but I know that Sault Ste. Marie seat is open and needs to be called. And I know that the New Democrats are keen to take it, but I also know that the Conservatives are campaigning there strongly. So I'll say this. What do we actually know? Well, it's a roughly fixed election date. It's 2018, May or June. Do you recall? June. And we have a government that's been decades basically in power, despite changing some faces after the McGuinty regime. So history tells us that the It doesn't look very good for the Liberals, right? But there's other facts that we should consider. This will be Mr. Brown's first run. Traditionally, leaders who run in their first elections don't often win. Now, Justin Trudeau is an exception to that rule, but it's not common that happens. Whereas Ms. Horvath and Ms. Wynne have many campaigns under their belt. So I was throwing out a theory with some colleagues this morning. You know, if I was Ms. Wynne, or conversely, if I was Mr. Hurley, I would think a slightly longer campaign duration might work to the Liberals' advantage, in the sense that there'd be more likelihood for Mr. Brown to trip up because he's got a new cohort of MPs, and I would suspect he's not well disciplined, particularly when we look at the examples of the Scarborough by-election and others. So I think people are really angry. Just to close up, I think they're really frustrated about hydro rates. I think that Wynne has stumbled on a number of issues and failed to get them in control. I think that while I applaud the recent moves she's made on housing, I think that they're a little late and they don't go far enough. I think really, frankly, a lot of that calls for a federal role in terms of social transfers on affordable housing and building more co-ops and that kind of stuff. But I'll leave it there, but I would say it's anyone's game at this point. I don't think it's a walk in the park for Patrick Brown. I really don't, although that's what the polls look like right now. But his polls are really the foundation, and perhaps others can speak to this, but it's very weak. People still don't know who this man is. And a reminder that he sat as a federal MP for many, many years, and people didn't know him there either. So, but he does have the Jason Kenney organization team, so you can't underestimate the power of his organizing team on the ground.
So Scott, given that Wynne is so low in the polls right now, what do you do to boost those prospects a year out?
Well, I think there's a couple of interesting things about that. As Kathleen mentioned, I'm not exactly an alien to the Wynne government and those guys. I've done a lot of work. And I know the Premier well, and she mentioned a fellow named Hurley. That's a guy named David Hurley, who's your compatriot on the it's not that issue. It's Insiders Panel for CBC, and Hurley is just about my closest friend, and we've worked together for many, many years. I think a couple things. Here's as a point of departure, and we talk about 7% and all that kind of stuff. But if any political operative said to you, "Listen, a year out from an election campaign, if you could be saying to yourself, you're going to be leading a government that is on the verge of balancing its budget, that has made record investments in infrastructure and transit, that has made record investments in healthcare and education, yeah, there's tons of pressures, but you would say to yourself, well, that feels to me like that's not a bad wicket to start from. The obvious issue is this, and I like the Premier personally. I know her well. I have a high regard for her. And she's not leaving. She'll campaign again. Something interesting has happened over the past 4 years. Prior to the 2014 campaign, Kathleen Wynne was perceived as a weak leader. I know this because of Hurley's research. She was seen as a weak leader. During the campaign, she transformed herself, think about that running ad, right? That's sort of into a determined, strong leader. She's now very much seen as a strong leader. The challenge is at some point, it didn't, people lost their connection with her. And so I think the big fundamental question is, can she find a way, either through a policy agenda or through her personal contact, reconnect with Ontario voters? Because there's almost an irrationality to her unpopularity. It really almost doesn't follow. If you look at it from a purely kind of cerebral standpoint, you're like, what's so damn awful here? And lots of people have lots of answers to that, but I just think there's a personal connection issue that's got to be addressed, and I don't know if it can be addressed, but it's got to be remedied, and if it isn't, it won't be fixed. Second thing I would say, just quickly on Patrick Brown, I think it's super interesting. One of the dangers you always have, if you're folks like us, is trying to win the next war on the basis of how you don't lose it the way you lost the last war. And I think the Conservatives in Ontario right now are very, very, very focused on the fact that they think they blew the last few elections, right? They made one big mistake. They blew it. They gave the government an opportunity and an issue to beat them with, so they want to avoid that. So when hydro rates were dropped by Kathleen Wynne, you heard immediately Patrick Brown say, I'm going to have a hydro plan of my own. I'm going to have it out in 10 days. He's withdrawn that. He blew back on that. Smart move, in my view, because he's not going to have a hydro rate plan that's going to actually stand up to scrutiny, that's going to be any better or much different. If it's different, it's probably not going to be sensible. If it's better, then it's probably going to be insensible. So he had a challenge. Better to just shut up. But if he loses this next campaign, which sounds like a preposterous notion right now, if he loses this campaign, it'll be because they focus so much on not losing this campaign the way they lost other ones. Because in the process, we know nothing about this cat. And I can tell you this, you will not remain an undefined figure in commodity before Election Day. So he's going to have to play some cards at some point. And they may be great cards, but if he plays them late, you run the risk that people may say, sorry, in the intervening period, while you were being cautious, I decided what I thought of you, and now I'm not going to turn it around. So it'll be, if they lose, I think it will be because of the strategy they pursued, which ironically was built to firewall themselves against the way they lost the previous campaigns.
So I want to ask you something, and you've probably heard this before about defining your opponent. And maybe let's unpack this a little bit for everybody here. What does it mean when you build, or you hear people talking about building a narrative around your opponent, especially new ones?
This is the challenge. I think Scott's precisely right. The challenge he describes for Mr. Brown is that they've internalized that the failure of past campaigns was that their program was rejected, that it was too ambitious, that it was too radical, and their instinct now, or the tension they're grappling with, is whether they can let the Premier defeat herself or whether they need to make the case for themselves. For what it's worth, I'm not as experienced as Kathleen and Scott, but what I've internalized from my experience in politics is people want to vote for something. We lost the 2004 campaign against Scott and Mr. Martin because we took for granted that voters would choose us because they weren't choosing them. It wasn't until 2006 when we put together a more compelling program, I think, that gave people a reason to vote for us, that we were able to form the government. And so Mr. Brown is grappling with this question. Because the policy program in 2014 was so roundly rejected, there is an instinct or a predisposition to float through and let this government defeat itself. I think that the two problems with that are, first of all, I'm not sure that it will be a successful electoral strategy, but more importantly, should he win, it's not a successful governing strategy. It would leave him with no agenda, no mandate, and no plan. And so, obviously, it doesn't mean he ought to be reckless. I presume we won't be committing to cutting 100,000 jobs this time around. But I do think there's an onus on him to put forward a program, and in so doing, not just define himself, but define what a Brown government would do to address the issues of concern on the minds of Ontarians. I just want to make two other real quick points. The first, one of the challenges that Premier Wynne has, besides her bad polling, is I can tell you from experience, it's not easy for a government to stay evergreen, to stay forward-looking in government. Government is all-consuming. It's highly transactional. And so governments have a tendency to run out of steam, to run out of ideas, simply because you're so preoccupied with putting out fires or responding to memoranda that come up from the public service or whatever. Incidentally, Premier Clark is testing this hypothesis. They've been in government since 2003, I think, and we'll see whether she's able to persuade British Columbians that she has a forward-looking agenda. I think the Wynne government has done its best to stay connected to stakeholders and public policy thinkers and others outside the system. But when you're dealing with the type of political pressure cooker that I suspect they are, given the polling numbers and other scandals, it seems to me that'll be something that's very difficult, and voters will see that it's a spent government.
You said something in there, and maybe Kathleen, you can talk about it a little bit. You hear it a lot in politics, the idea of governments, opposition parties don't defeat governments, governments defeat themselves. Mm-hmm. What does that mean when you hear that?
Well, two things. I think that the reason why Sean might have thought in 2004 that it would have been a cakewalk for the Conservatives federally is because the Liberal government at the time was embroiled in scandal after scandal and just thought, okay, well, these people are just going to blow up. I don't need to do anything else. And so that's the example of governments defeating themselves, and similarly why Sean highlights the questions that Brown is grappling with in terms of maybe she'll just blow up, maybe she'll disappear. But like Scott, I agree that Wynne has a base of people in Ontario who still, particularly in the 416 area, I would say, that are quite wedded to her and like her as an individual. I used to joke that, oh, Kathleen Wynne, she's the perfectly formed human. You know, everyone likes her. She's very likable, and that's why she's a difficult candidate to run against. I'll pivot just slightly here, Jen, not avoiding your question, but just saying that in terms of the question you asked earlier about definition and defining your candidate. I mean, there's a rule that we all use: define or be defined, right? And Scott talked about Ignatieff, but I think the real case and example is really the Dion disaster that happened just prior to him, right? Like, it's not easy to make priority, like that, and that whole idea of the distracted academic, how he was being positioned. And I think he still suffered from that as Minister of Foreign Affairs recently. And so it is amazing to me that no third party, no other political party has come out and really tried to take hard-hitting ads against Brown to try to undercut him. So full disclosure, I was a part of helped co-found a small, a progressive super PAC in the last 2015 election that worked to do that defining ads against Harper. And it was called Engage Canada. And we just decided that no one was on the ice hitting Harper. And so that we decided as Liberals and New Democrats to get together and throw some punches at him in advance of the election campaign. And so I'm surprised that a similar initiative hasn't taken place on the progressive side here in Ontario.
Scott, so the Ontario budget's coming up. There'll be two before the next election, I suppose. Based on your experience, how do governments use budgets to help with their election prospects?
Well, it really varies. It varies by government. It varies by situation. In the year 2000, I was working in the finance minister's office, and we actually used an economic statement, the fall update, to trigger an election. We used it instead. We turned it into a budget. We introduced, sweeping tax relief. It was the largest tax relief package in history at the time, and used that as a springboard to go into the campaign, and in part to try to inoculate where we saw the threat coming from the right of center. So we tried to take away the tax relief issue and use that to our advantage. It was generally successful. It was a pretty good campaign, and we increased our seat count actually in a number of places across the country from 1997, which people forget, but the 1997 campaign, Liberals came this close to being reduced to a minority. I think in Ontario, let's go back to something that everyone else was here talking about a moment ago. How, when you're in government, particularly Sean was making this point, when you're in government, how do you reinvent yourself? Especially when you've been in government through one leader or two for successive mandates. And I think the task of this budget is to put the cap on the previous era, right? Is to say, we told you among many other things that we would get ourselves to a position of fiscal balance. We've done that. I don't think that the Wynne government has been terribly effective in terms of having a meta-narrative about itself and what it's up to, what its kind of cornerstone plan is. So I think the budget and how the Premier intervenes in the budget before, after, in and around it is really going to be the starting pistol for the next campaign, in the sense that I think that's where we will see her begin to articulate a post-budget, past 4 or 5 years plan. This is what I'm going to be about. This is what I'm going to do. The balanced budget is effectively a milestone that says, we did all that, now where are we going? And I think they've got to do that. They absolutely have to do that. It's still very difficult when you're in government, but for all the reasons Sean said, because I think if this government tries to coast in on saying, we've done these things, we think our record rocks, don't you? They're not going to like the answer. And I'm not sure that Christie's going to like the answer out in BC either. And I've been friends with Christie for 25 years, but I'm a little worried that her campaign is built around, hey, if you don't like what you see, then you're going to love what comes next. And, I think government's got to be careful about that. So I think the budget will be used to try to unveil a new narrative and a new set of initiatives and a new plan, fundamentally.
And it's handy when you're in government because you have access to all the statistics and all the numbers and all the bureaucrats that can compile all that stuff for you as you're crafting your budget/platform. Let's talk about the federal election, which is still 2 years away, but it's hard to believe that we're already halfway there. What do you all think about how Trudeau's done his performance? Trying to be as objective as you can. What do you think about the performance of the federal government so far?
You know what? They know their lane. So I actually think there's...
They know their lane?
They know their... No. They know their lane.
It's like, wow!
You see them, they walk around Spark Street and they say, Jesus, we suck. Don't I want to stay indoors? No, they know their lane. N, as in new government, as in not the NDP. N. Bada boom!
I thought the whole point was that they were running as the NDP, sort of.
I think this government really does know its lane. And, a lot of people roll their eyes and they go, oh, God, selfie PM and all this stuff, and more PM. Hey, man, until there's evidence that it's not yielding fruit, continue to plant those seeds and harvest that bounty. And so I think that's the first thing. The second thing is I think there's actually been already 2 governments, and we're just barely getting into the second Trudeau government. And by that I mean this. And it's shocking that we've been able to talk politics for 20 minutes here and this hasn't come up. Trump.
Yeah, it's
right?
true.
It's the whole freaking world is Trump. And so if you're Trudeau, you go, well, I ran, Harper had been in for 10 years and there was a, time for change. I played my cards right, won the election. That's great. I've got a program. I'm going to unfold it. And now all of a sudden, holy moly, Donald Trump is president of the United States, right? That is the event that for sure is going to define his first term in office, probably will have a large part to do with how he frames his re-election effort, how successful his re-election effort is. So we're just at the beginning of the Trudeau, right, dealing with Trump term. And that's what the next 2.5 years are going to be about for him. And that's what it should be about. And the nice thing for Trudeau, the nice advantage is that it's very hard for the opposition to play on that territory. By definition, right, when you got such a pronounced set of issues and conflicts to deal with from Trump, look at what he's had to say on trade just the last couple of days, right? It is to government that it falls. So Trudeau can persistently position himself not as a partisan, but someone who's acting in the public interest on these files, trying his best to mitigate what I think a lot of people in Canada, a lot of voters, will look at as the irrationality of a madman. And that's, I think, going to play to his advantage, unless they make big mistakes.
Sean?
I would just say 2 things about Mr. Trudeau and his government. The first is I can tell you that I worked with his incoming team during the transition, and he is surrounded by some wonderful people. But I took some solace in the fact that you won't be surprised to discover Conservatives think that the Liberals have a governing plan that dates back to Laurier, and they dust it off during Conservative interregnums and get back to the business of being the natural governing party of Canada. I was pleased to discover that these guys, after 13 years out of office and a generational change in terms of the composition of the people around the Prime Minister and the broader team, weren't particularly more familiar or had less institutional knowledge than we did when we arrived in 2006. And so I think it's taken them some time, as it takes any government.
Well, hold on a second. What do you mean by institutional knowledge?
Well, they didn't know where the washroom was, let alone the mechanics of governing, the rhythm of governing, the way to advance a program within the system, but also in terms of building a case publicly. So they've they had a fairly clearly defined platform, and so they could kind of go on autopilot and focus on implementing the platform while they figured out how to run the country. But I do think that explains the extent to which there's been a bit of a lack of ambition that I suspect most people wouldn't have anticipated back in October 2015. But I worry a bit for them about this lack of ambition. I wouldn't have guessed that the 2017 budget would have been as unambitious as it was. Of course, the Trump presidency can explain some of that, but I don't think that fully explains the extent to which a number of big files that people anticipated, whether it's a reform of science policy, transportation policy, which had been the subject of a major review, speculation about privatizing airports, and a whole other host of files of Veterans Affairs, First Nations. I mean, just they've really set expectations high on a number of files. And as many of you know, because you're astute followers, the second budget of a majority government tends to be the peak of a government's ambition, a time when you're prepared to expend political capital because of the distance in proximity from the next federal election. And so if this government took a pass on all of those issues in its second year, it seems to me less likely that we can anticipate progress on some of those files in a third or fourth year. And for many progressive voters who left the New Democrats in 2015 and were drawn to Mr. Trudeau's vision, I think it represents a real opening for the NDP when this leadership election is complete to say, what did you get for this? This isn't the progressivism that we were promised, and it's a way to breathe, frankly, new life into the New Democrats in the lead up to the next election.
Yeah,
I'm going to ask you a different question, and then we're going to go to questions from the audience. So, sorry, Kathleen, I'll ask you, from the opposition's point of view, given that both parties, so the Conservatives and the NDP are in the midst of choosing new leaders, the election's only 2 years away. What do they have to do in such a short period of time to be able to go up against someone who won with such a healthy majority in the last election?
Yeah, it's a heavy lift for the New Democrats because they chose such a long, crazy long, in fact the Conservatives did too, but the New Democrats really tripped up on this by choosing such a long leadership convention plan, where we'll only have our leader defined basically in November, December. The Conservatives will have their leader established in the end of May. So all of these great heights that Justin Trudeau is soaring to in terms of popularity, is without two real opposition leaders, which is significant. In terms of what they have to do, they have to brand their leader, define their leader, get their leader out on tours. It's not going to be a very pretty sight for either of the two teams. That said, I would say that the Conservatives really have a strong base with approximately 100 MPs, well-staffed, well-resourced, veteran members who have been in government, people like Mike Storshaw, people like Gary Keller, like they're very strong tacticians and strategists. New Democrats, truthfully, I include myself as one of them, spent 2016 sucking our thumbs. Like really, we did. It was tragic what happened in 2015, but there are some bright spots. So just to double back really quickly on the last question, I want to say in terms of positive stuff, what the Liberals have done to be that objective self that you asked me to be, listen, I think Canadians are still dancing in the street. I use this line in every speech because I still think they are. They're dancing in the street because Trudeau brought the census back. I don't know why, but Canadians love data. They love the census. So really, if Trudeau just sat for the first couple of years and undid Harper's legacy, that was almost enough for them. In 2015, they were so fed up. Those voters, New Democrat, Liberal, others, even some progressive Conservatives, voted against Harper because they just thought, his agenda was too mean. So many of the measures that Trudeau has done has been undoing Harper's legacy. But for New Democrats, as Sean ably pointed out, there is a disturbing pattern emerging, and it relates to Trump. Trudeau has backtracked on a few things: electoral reform, some could say pipelines, many other issues. I've said, in terms of deficits, some stuff like that would only be capped at $10 billion, I think. He I used to say that there's a truck backing up, like beep, 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 over all of his campaign promises. And now with the introduction of Trump, which I completely agree with Scott, has like seized Ottawa and politics in a way that really hasn't been seen, where this federal government is now reorientating entire cabinet committees, staffing changes, the whole bit, entire cabinet positions based on his election. Trump now presents, I think, a challenge to the Liberals and an opportunity for New Democrats, in that New Democrats are frustrated, and lots of progressive voters are frustrated in the fact that Trudeau isn't taking a stronger stand on some of the social issues such as immigration, and want to see Trudeau take a stronger line. So I think there is an opportunity for a new Democratic leader to kind of speak to that base and bring them in.
Thank you. So I would love to take some questions from the audience. And are there microphones in the back? Is that how? Yep. Okay. And there's some people holding up microphones for anyone who has a question. I see one over here. Go ahead.
First of all, thank you very much. I love that. In the beginning, you talked about the permanent campaign, and you talked about the shift after Chrétien's financial structure, and really largely since I'd say 2003, 2004, towards more negative campaigning. Like, I used to associate it more with the States than today, and it doesn't seem to have gone away. It seems to have progressed. I don't think we're at Trump's level yet, but that I find a lot of my students struggle with, right? Because in class, we talk about debates and how you argue, and you don't attack the person, and like you attack the idea and support. And then they go when they watch political debates, and it's all about attacking the person and like showing posters of this person and do you trust this person and blah. And so I do think it's contributing to political disengagement for youth. How do you think we can tackle that in our classrooms?
So just quickly, I would say a couple things. The data and the testing about advertising, positive versus negative, shows that negative ads, I think, are twice or more times as sticky, right? The information sticks with viewers and listeners in a way that positive advertising doesn't. So it works, I guess, I would say, from an advertising point of view. Not necessarily that I'm advocating for it, but I do strongly believe in contrast ads. I do. So we did this ad in 2011 with Jack about Mr. Ignatieff. You didn't show up for work, You were at X number of debates. That's a matter of public record. And I believe strongly that you're able to be called out on that kind of stuff. Or in my Engage Canada project, I called out Harper on his cuts to programs, whether it was women's health programs or the healthcare budget transfers. And I think that's fair. I don't think you do what others have done in the past in terms of attacking a person's, the famous Chrétien attack ad or others that have been done. In terms of engagement, though, in students, I think that's where the lens of teachers is so important, to kind of do that deconstruct and critical thinking part, where you actually unpack the ad and you make sure you know, first of all, who's producing the ad, where is this coming from, what stakeholders pay for it, what's their agenda, and then also what imagery is being used. Like, I did this one ad against Harper in the last election where I had thunderbolts and a scary picture of Mike Duffy in the back, looming in clouds, and I thought it was awesome. You should watch it. It's great. But it's
still in my nightmares.
It's still in Sean's nightmares. It was the best ad. But, factually it's right. But we did torque the imagery to make it basically, if you vote for Harper, you're going to get struck by a thunderbolt, Or conversely, we had another one that was a Canadian flag, that was beating like a heart. Boom, boom. Boom, 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 and then it flatlined. It got faster and faster because of evil Harper, right? So we basically killed Canada. Now, and listen, I just want to quickly make one caveat that I don't think big money should be involved in politics, and I wish there were more rules around this. Certainly BC, which Scott has mentioned a few times, is the wild, wild west of politics right now. There are more rules in Ontario, good rules coming in Alberta, obviously, and elsewhere, and federally the rules exist as well. But I guess why I participated in these super PACs and what I would ask high-value contrast ads is because I believe that progressives need a voice there too, because they've been dominated in the past by corporations or by right wing. So that's my defense to it, but I'm happy to bail out if everybody else is going to bail out too.
Thanks. You want to go ahead?
Sure. Yeah, because I think distinctions between contrast ads and all that stuff, I think that's largely horseshit, excuse me. But I do, and I'm sorry, Kathleen, I don't mean that to be unpleasant, but it's negative. We know it's negative. We know we're trying to prey on negative emotional impulses to try to provoke an outcome we prefer electorally. Here's, I think, the interesting thing. Most people I know who have run election campaigns at a high level, who I think really well of from a political professional standpoint, are deeply troubled by negative campaigning, particularly the power of negative advertising. And they're troubled by it because they know two things. They know it's effective, and they know it has the effect of fostering cynicism, skepticism, disengagement. They know, like, I mean, there really isn't a big debate about whether or not that's the consequence. The problem is this, and I don't know how to fix this problem, and so I don't think it's going to get fixed. The problem is that you are running a campaign, and you have to take the shortest distance between yourself and success. And so we are in this peculiar place where there are some exceptions, depending upon where you are in the rhythm of change and all that kind of stuff, and you can play the hope card and all that. But fundamentally, our cynicism and skepticism towards those in elected office is so high, our immediate assumption that their motives are blemished is so immediate that we will believe something that someone says negatively about someone else before we will believe something positive that a politician says about themselves. And so it's simple math. I don't get rewarded for losing a campaign. Like everything else in the world, it all works on the principle of incentives. My incentive if I'm running a campaign is to win, not lose. And that is one of the most effective ways to win. The consequence of it is that I foul my own nest. And I find a lot of people who are really intelligent at a very, like, this isn't just things that people sort of say, oh, is this a naive discussion? It isn't a naive discussion. It isn't a Pollyannish discussion. The most hardened sort of political vets I know have this debate all the time because they're conscious of it, but I don't know what the escape is. I know if I was running an election campaign right now, certainly if I was running an election campaign for Win tomorrow, I would be thinking almost immediately about how I can negatively define Patrick Brown. And to me, I wouldn't have, and I could call it a contrast ad or a negative ad or whatever the hell I want to call it, but at the end of the day, I wouldn't have a practical alternative to that. That's probably among my best strategies. So I think you need to teach kids about that. I don't mean to say that in a declarative way, like as though I'm being patronizing. I think that we just need to have that dialogue and discussion, but with folks and try to make them as literate as possible at it. But I don't know what the fix is, and I don't know how that trend doesn't go in a real negative way. I do think there's one line. I'll stop finally speaking, Sean. I think there's one line, and this is a line that even when we saw lots of negative advertising over the years, this line never used to be crossed, but now it is crossed. And that is, I won't deliberately say something that I know to be untrue about my opponent. And now people are not guided by that principle. Not all people, but frequently we see campaigns are no longer guided by that principle. They're guided by a different principle, a competing principle, which is it likely that the audience about which I care will believe it? So I'll say it if it's untrue because I think it will be viewed as true. And I think that's a troubling thing. I think at some point you have to actually say to yourself, like, that's a line we can't cross. I can't say that Kathleen was in prison for 7 years, right? When I know it's not true. And then, I was 6. Like,
some of your surrogates can say it, which is a whole other topic.
Right, and that happens. And, I think that's something that, we have to, we should ask political actors to really to account for.
Okay, I'm going to take a question over here, and you can answer that one. Yes, over there.
Hi. Do you think the issue of electoral reform is gone for good? So I have a couple parts to my question. Could it or will it become a campaign issue for the Liberals in a couple of years? And do you think that electoral reform is necessary to increase voter turnout? My students and I, we debated this question before it sort of became a dead issue, and they said to me, pros of proportional representation is every vote matters. The cons is no one understands it. So when Trudeau said, oh, we asked a bunch of Canadians if they want electoral reform, and they said no. Well, no, we didn't really ask enough of us, and did we really know what we were being asked? So are we going to get asked again, and will this ever happen?
It's a good question, Sean.
It's a great question. As a matter of fact, I just participated in a roundtable discussion with the Democratic Reform Minister a couple of days ago, because, of course, the government is now trying to move on beyond this narrow commitment and think more broadly about improving the functioning of our democracy, which, as I'll describe in a minute, is, I think, a positive step. On the narrow question of the future of electoral reform, I think this is precisely the kind of issue that has the potential to breathe new life in the New Democrats, who, of course, as Kathleen says, come out of the 2015 campaign facing, I think, some existential questions about their place in Canada's politics, what their value proposition is vis-a-vis the Liberal Party. And so this is precisely the type of thing, I think, where the NDP has the potential to re-engage progressive voters. But on the broader question of electoral reform, I think one of the unfortunate consequences, I think, of this preoccupation with electoral reform is it tends to be characterized, I think, at least by some, as a silver bullet, when I think there are many other ways to improve the functioning of our democracy that are less divisive and, frankly, in an incremental way, can have a significant impact. One area in particular is strengthening the role of parliamentarians. I know that may be funny for some of you to hear, given that I work for Mr. Harper, who, of course, has a reputation for being a top-down leader. But it's something I feel strongly about. I've just read this week an essay about Alexander Galt, who, as many of you know, was Canada's first finance minister. And Galt contrasts Canadian democracy with the U.S. presidential system, which he saw as autocratic because, of course, the president was elected for a 4-year cycle and didn't have to return to voters or, frankly, anybody else in the intervening time, where, of course, in a properly functioning Westminster system, the government is having to secure the confidence of Parliament on a daily basis. Now, of course, that's not how it's come to be in practice for a whole host of reasons. But I do think there are some practical steps that we can take to strengthen the role of our parliamentarians. And to the Trudeau government's credit, they've done some of those things. Restoring responsibility for approving borrowing limits to Parliament, increasing MP budgets, reforming the role of the parliamentary budget officer. And I think there are many more that we can undertake. And so at the risk of rambling, I would just say we can have a debate about electoral reform, and I'm afraid I don't even know what I think. I have kind of ambivalent views. But the extent to which its demise opens up a broader discussion about strengthening our democracy, I think it's a positive and healthy thing.
Another question, Roji? No? One thing I think we should talk about, because it's sort of integral to any discussion about politics today, is the media. And we discuss it a lot as media organizations, but do politicians even care about traditional media anymore, since they have all these great platforms to talk to you and your students directly? Twitter, Snapchat, Instagram, YouTube, Facebook. Why do they need to talk to anybody from CBC or CP or Kathleen?
So just one thing, when I was working on one side of the camera when I was at CTV, all I did every day was just chase politicians, and it was I would bug people like Scott, can I please have an interview with, or can I please do a feature on X? And then when I started to work with politicians, I couldn't get over how obsessed they were with the media. When you actually sit in a caucus room and all they talk about is so-and-so's article or this or that, or did you believe the coverage, or how come I wasn't included? So that that alone was fascinating to me over the period of that 10 years. But I would say that they are still obsessed with mainstream media, and they also are increasingly diving into these kind of more targeted channels that Jennifer mentioned. So whether it's using Twitter, using things like even LinkedIn, the federal government spent $1 million. Departments really, but targeting ads in the first quarter of this year alone on LinkedIn, doing digital marketing. So it's all different platforms. And now they can create so much media themselves in terms of just doing their own videos. Look at Harper. Sean perhaps could speak to this. He developed his own news channel when he was in office in terms of the 24, what was it called? 24-7. 24/7.
Harper, him all the time.
All the time, yeah, no, not at all, yeah. So I do think that getting around the accountability, we've spoken about this for years. George Bush kind of started this, and I think Harper perfected it in terms of going around mainstream media to try to touch regional media or in some cultural media at times to avoid the accountability of the National Press Gallery, and then also highly constricting the National Press Gallery in terms of their access and ability to question, closing down things like cabinet outs, which were a regular thing when Scott was in office and have now returned to Parliament, but weren't for a very long time.
One thing I noticed in the last federal election, more so than previous ones, and I guess it's because it's a progression, but individuals using Twitter or different tools could actually grab the attention of the mainstream media or the politicians and sway a news day. There's one Indigenous blogger that I can think of that broke several stories himself just from his own research. And I wonder what that tells us about the power that citizens can have now through social media, or is that overstated?
I think it may be overstated, but I think the fundamental observation is indisputable. It is happening. And it'll continue to happen, and then we'll have to continue to work through those tough questions of, well, what's the validity and what's the authority of that person? How do we know anything about their the veracity of their their standing? So sort of with that. But I mean, just on this question of will politicians abandon earned media, the media? I think the real question is, will media abandon the politicians? So I mean, let's ask this question. Let's pretend this is happening in the spring of 2018. It's entirely possible 1 year from now, post-media doesn't exist. What does that mean? It means that the Windsor Star, the Montreal Gazette, right? The Calgary Herald, Vancouver Sun, National Post. Who gives a damn about the National Post? But on and on and on. These are the fundamental sort of news organs of communities from a newspaper standpoint, from a print standpoint, right? The Southern Chain before that, all. And if they all go down, because the financial model for media overall is crippled, and the financial media for post-media is particularly gruesome, if they go down, what happens? It's not obvious to me. I worked for the Ottawa Citizens for a number of years. It's not obvious to me that the Ottawa Citizen, who's going to buy it? Like, who wants to buy the printing press for the Ottawa Citizen and say, all right, now I'm going to run a daily newspaper? There's no financial success. Well, maybe something start up, a little bit more of a digital thing, twice a week, something comes out, yeah, maybe that kind of stuff. But land on your doorstep, now, maybe is that the evolution of time or what? Second closely related question is, what happens to all the standards? Jen was a journalist. Went to J school, trained in journalism, had to answer to bosses, editorial control, had to defend choices she made, but have to defend mistakes she'd made, right? Right now, I write all the time. And who knows anything?
There's no accountability.
No accountability. Zero accountability. They put a little plug saying you used to work in politics. This is kind of what his line is. But who knows? You ask yourself, do people self-declare their conflicts? Do they self-declare what their biases are? Do we have any idea? Is there any real control? If a news organization pays you nothing, guess how much editorial control they have correspondingly? So, and it's been more and more prevalent because clickbait world, it's a hot takes world. So now what fills up a lot of that media space? Hot takes. That's what drives clicks. That's what drives traffic. That's the only metric that makes any sense financially. But a lot of it is just who actually can call someone an asshole in the cleverest, funniest way. So it's this hot takes world. So to me, I think the blurriness of the media model, the traditionally earned media model, from a financial, from an ethical, from a coverage standpoint. All those things really, I think, they're far more consequential than the desire of politicians to have a camera in the corner and make people watch them eating eggs.
Was there another question? Okay, yes. Hi.
Hi. Just a quick question. When do you foresee it not being political suicide to open the debate of faith-based schooling, publicly funding faith-based schooling?
You mean do we still have two systems in Ontario?
Yeah.
I love that question. I wonder that all the time as a taxpayer.
Well, sorry, can I ask a question? Is that exactly what you mean? Like, are you talking about whether or not you didn't have a public and Catholic, or?
Let's start a super PAC for that. Anyway, that's not a popular.
I may have to recuse myself from this discussion as the parents, as the daughter of two Catholic school teachers. But yeah, I mean, it has really been the third rail in Ontario in terms of education. That's what I would say. That no. I mean, didn't Tory try to go there? Yeah, Tory tried to go there, and it was a disaster. Yeah.
But other provinces have gotten here. I mean, my sister works for the Lester B. Pearson School Board in Montreal, and they managed to do it. They managed to split it by linguistic lines rather than, I don't know, Sean, if you have a view on that?
I'm afraid not. I don't have an informed view.
I just wonder, could it have anything to do with the political power of teachers? I'm joking, but I'm not joking. I'd be scared to death of touching it. It's the kind of thing that if somebody does it, they're going to do it. They're not going to campaign on it.
Yeah.
Thank you for the question.
Just to feed on what, and good question over there, but for a resource for you guys, just in relation to what Scott was just saying, have you heard of the Shattered Mirror report?
Yeah, shatteredmirror.ca.
It's a great report from the Public Policy Forum, so it's a great resource for you. It's a report on the state of media in Canada, and it has some really great tools online, some quick videos and bits and pieces that would be really useful to for maybe if you're interested in the question around media in the classroom and around what it does to our democracy. So I'd encourage you to look at that, especially in light of the fact that that whole disruption that has happened to our print world, which Scott just outlined in terms of what's happening to our newspapers, is also coming to broadcast. So I think it's a great resource in terms of the intersection of media, democracy, and politics.
I think we have time for, we can do these last two questions here. Yeah. Yes, sir.
We've talked about mainstream media, but I'd really be curious to see what the panelists think about, are we richer for the presence of like admitted bias media? Like I want to think of, I'm thinking about the Rebel and Ezra Levant, but I guess maybe Rabble.ca, and there's slightly less odious examples than the Rebel, but is our tapestry better off, or are we better off as a country because those voices are out there saying what they say, or is it cheapening things and hurting our ability to have the polity?
It's an interesting question because in Europe they have a long tradition of partisan media, and some people would argue better voter turnout depending on the country. I don't know, Sean, if this is something that you've considered about partisan media, whether it helps our system or hurts it.
I suspect I'm probably the least anxious about fragmentation. I have confidence in the market. I think we've even witnessed just in the recent weeks, frankly, that traditional organizations like the New York Times and the Washington Post have done some of the best work they've done in a long time. And I think that the competitive pressures that have been imposed on them by this process of fragmentation is part of the reason. Now, I'm the least knowledgeable about the industry on the panel, but I have confidence that there's a marketplace for good quality media, and that smarter people than me will figure out how to transform the model. But I agree with what others have said. Just to give you a sense, because I was involved in 2011 and 2015 election campaigns. In 2011, we had 2 press secretaries travel with Mr. Harper and a busload of reporters. It was like 3-to-1 reporter to press secretary, maybe even more. In 2015, we had a press secretary for every reporter. And in 2011, we had a lockup. An embargoed copy of the Conservative Party of Canada's election manifesto was in a room, and reporters could review it and ask questions. And I think there was probably about 50 reporters in that room. In 2015, there was like half a dozen. They each had their own dedicated staffer. And I think that's really symbolic of this transformation that Scott describes.
One thing you might be interested in as a resource is the Pew Center in the United States is a think tank. It has a whole section on the media. And they've done research in the last few years about how people are becoming more polarized in their thinking. And so they're gravitating more and more towards the media that aligns with what their political thinking is. So, I mean, could be the subject of a whole other panel. But you wonder what that's going to do to us as a society over time if everybody is so entrenched in their camps, I guess.
And just to add on that, I'll send Taylor the link and perhaps he could distribute it. But there's a great test that the Wall Street Journal put together about you put in various identifiers about yourself and you bring up your own Facebook feed. And that they were trying to demonstrate or illustrate the challenges with Facebook and the algorithm about what news feeds you would end up getting and how exactly what Jen was saying, you get driven into a lane of the same kind of thinking again and again and again as opposed to hearing more diverse voices. So one thing in terms of that critical thinking and that lens that you want to give to your students is, diversify your social streams, listen to, I always say to people, I learn from Scott's tactics, I learn from Sean's strategy, and I learn how to better my activities. And so listen to your opponents, watch what they're doing, listen, have a more diverse, and talk to these people. Like Obama famously said, I think on exiting his presidency, like, stop yelling at these people on Twitter and sit down and have a real conversation with them. So encourage your students to kind of do that kind of stuff.
I just wanted to add one quick thought on that question, though. I'm not at all concerned about fragmentation or the multiplicity of voices. The internet's an awful big place. I assume that everybody can fit. I'm concerned about who gets to label themselves a journalist. I'm concerned about standards and accountability. That's what I'm worried about, is that a bunch of things are news, but not everything is journalism, right? And so Rebel.com, CA, whatever the heck it is, go crazy. But it's not journalism, right? That's what it isn't. It's people advocating a point of view. And so I just think there might be good writing on there, there might be good broadcasting on there if that's your cup of tea. But I think we have to, like Jen was a journalist, right? Like, there's a standard there. There's a set of accountabilities that she has. And I think we have to be more definitive about that these days rather than less definitive because of the multiplicity of voices and information sources.
I apologize. I think we've run out of time, but maybe after the thank you, and thanks for being such a great audience. And I think some of us will be here a little longer.
Do we have time for one more question?
I just told her she couldn't have hers, so I think we're right at time. But Taylor?
Well, I mean, we do, but you had said before.
We can do, why don't we do two last ones, and then, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Rapid
do
fire.
Do you see someone like Kevin O'Leary having the same kind of rise to power in Canada that someone like Donald Trump had?
And take that one too. No, double barrel it. Yeah, go, get them in. And we'll just answer really quickly. Short answer.
Okay. Hi there. With leadership races going on with, say, the Conservatives and NDP, we get, a focus of different leaders. But I think it would be a good idea, and I wonder if the media could ever present this, of the actual voting system that they use for leadership races, so Canadians know that we use different systems. So if it's good enough for them, how come it's not good enough for us? And then maybe it would educate people that there are different systems, different ways of electing a leader, and then we don't have to bother with have your say where we don't really get to have our say, and we could actually see it in practice if it's rank balloting, et cetera.
Okay.
It's a great question, and they're definitely interlinked. Let me just be as brief as I can. First, I think the fundraising changes that Mr. Martin brought in and Mr. Chrétien brought in rather, and Mr. Harper expanded upon. I think one of the strengths of them is that they've kept politicians connected to individual folks. We don't have politicians bought and paid for by large corporate interests. And I think that's a major reason why we've not seen the type of populist politics that's taken hold in other places, because people feel confident that their politicians are much more closely focused on their interests and aspirations and concerns. I think that's a good thing, by the way. On the question of Mr. O'Leary, it's very closely connected to the question. A lot of people, the comparison with Mr. Trump is inevitable. What people fail to realize, of course, is that Mr. Trump was elected in a first-past-the-post system. In fact, he didn't exceed 50% of the vote until much later than Republican nominees in decades. He was winning state primaries with 30, 35%. The Conservative Party of Canada, ironically, selects its leader with a ranked ballot system, not with a first-past-the-post system. So someone like Mr. O'Leary can't simply win with 20 or 30%. He has to exceed 50% plus one, and they'll continue to vote until one of the candidates reaches that threshold. I think one of the challenges Mr. O'Leary has is that it's very likely or quite possible that he's amongst the leading candidates on a first or even second ballot. But this is just personal conjecture. I think he has a low ceiling. That is, that he'll have difficult time getting to 50% plus one, given that there are 14 candidates participating. I think it's much more likely on a fourth or fifth ballot we have a compromise candidate ultimately exceed that threshold who have lower negatives than Mr. O'Leary.
On O'Leary, I would just say I got no truck or trade for the guy, right? Like, personally, it's just like, I think it's a triumph of idiocy and ignorance, and I've done a lot of broadcasting with him, but as a political professional or whatever, wanker you want to call me, I think he's interesting. And he's interesting because he knows how to communicate in a way that sounds definitively unlike other politicians, which is exactly what, and there's lots of pieces to this puzzle, but that is exactly what was most compelling about Trump initially. You listen to those 17 people, they all sounded like politicians prepared statements. He sounded different, and he struck you differently. And I think that's true of O'Leary, and it makes him very dangerous, because when you combine that and the trust that people then seem to be willing to surrender to him with a kind of, populist, uninformed point of view, I think you end up in a place where if it takes off, it can get dangerous, like I think it's gotten dangerous south of the border.
I agree with everything my colleagues. I agree with everything my colleagues have just said, and the only point of information, I was sitting with his campaign chair last night, O'Leary's campaign chair, at a dinner, and he thinks that it's going to go 13 ballots. Like, he doesn't think it's going to be, and probably to Sean's point, he may not make it. But to the other question about the nature of the voting systems, I think you're right that they need to be articulated more by the media and by others, because what our parties are doing are vastly different. New Democrats are doing a one-member, one-vote, not weighted by region or affiliation across the country, and you can actually, if you're voting online, you can change your ballot as the weeks go on, because we're doing this crazy thing. If it starts in September and ends in October, where for 5 weeks we will continue to vote. And so it's like a virtual horse trading that will happen over a series of weeks. It's kind of complicated, but not as complicated as their system, which is weighted by 100 votes per riding. So 100 votes in 338 ridings across the country. So not weighted by density of membership or number of votes. And what's significant about that is, the number you need to reach then is 16,900 votes to win, to take the contest. Of course, Maxime Bernier thinks he's there already. We'll see. But you actually have to work the regions in a way, and it disadvantages places where there's high conservative membership.
One last thing I'll just say for your students when they're looking at a leadership race is that often basically all the time, the leadership candidates are not campaigning for you. They're campaigning for memberships, to sell memberships to people who are in the same alignment with them. So they'll campaign, if it's the Conservatives, they're campaigning to the right, and then when they have to come to the election time, they campaign down the middle, and the same will be true of the NDP. They'll be really focusing on the left because that's where their membership is, and then once the general election comes, then they have to soften things a bit. So there's interesting particularities about leadership races that aren't the same as a general election. Anyway, thank you again. It was awesome, and hope to be back.